Going back to the fighting in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive was the turning point for the battle. In January of 1968, the Viet Cong launched a surprise attack on 36 South Vietnamese cities. This was known as the Tet Offensive. It was called this because it was supposed to be a ceasefire for the Vietnamese New Year, which is known as Tet. The U.S. forces were able to repel the attack, but the media reported it as a loss for U.S. forces. This offensive simply proved to Americans that the communists were not giving up, although William Westmoreland had reported that at any moment the Vietnamese were going to give up. So for all his failures in the Vietnam War, Lyndon B. Johnson did not run for re-election in 1968. Unrest outside the Chicago Democratic Convention displayed how angry Americans were with the U.S. government. Also, during 1968, both Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated. The top picture there shows people pointing. Martin Luther King has just been shot, he's on the ground, and people are pointing to the place where the gunshot came from. Bottom picture is the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. So in the campaign, Richard Nixon was the Republican running. He promised to end the war and appealed to what was known as the silent majority. The silent majority was Americans who were not protesting the war. These were young people, silent people, the unblack and the unpoor. Nixon's plan for ending the war in Vietnam was called Vietnamization. This was the slow, gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops and handing over the war to the South Vietnamese, letting them fight their own battle with the North Vietnamese. Sort of like what we've done in Iraq, pulling troops out, letting it be handled by the people in Iraq. This was an attempt for the U.S. to get out of the Vietnam War gracefully and achieve peace with honor. However, Nixon was slow to deliver on his promises. For all his promises to withdraw troops, he then went ahead and secretly bombed Cambodia and Laos, which made it appear that he was actually expanding the war, not trying to get out of it. Then, again in 1968, U.S. troops went into a small village known as My Lai and murdered all of the people living in that village. Hundreds and hundreds of people. The picture on the top was the road leading into the village. You can see it's just littered with bodies. The picture to the left is a group of Vietnamese women and children just before they are murdered by machine gun. The trial of the U.S. troops involved became public in 1971 and only served as greater evidence for why we should not be in Vietnam. As more and more negative publicity came out of Vietnam, protests at home became more intense, particularly on college campuses. At Kent State University, an anti-war protest turned deadly as 4 students were killed by the National Guard. That is the picture on the top right. This conflict displayed the tension between the hawks and the doves, the protesters and the silent majority. Then in 1971, the Pentagon Papers were published. The Pentagon Papers were confidential documents that were published detailing the dishonest and deceitful policies of the United States in Vietnam. So you remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, instigating the war with Vietnam. The misleading statements by William Westmoreland. Lots of deceit that happened regarding Vietnam. Pentagon Papers were published for the public in the New York Times, and this widened what is called the credibility gap. If you remember, I talked about it in the last video. The credibility gap is this growing distrust of the U.S. government by the American public. Finally, in 1973, the U.S. and North Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords. This ended the fighting. It meant the U.S. would withdraw all their troops, POWs would be exchanged, but the North Vietnamese administration would remain in the South. 550 prisoners of war were returned, and as soon as the U.S. left, Saigon fell to the Communists in 1975. Vietnam War's impact on the United States was devastating. Money, of course, was taken from places that was needed internally, like education and healthcare, and instead spent on military. In addition, the U.S. suffered heavy military losses. About 55,000 people died, and had a very negative reaction from the American public. The War Powers Act was passed. This was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Because of that, we now decided that it would be better if we required the president to consult with Congress before committing troops. Obviously, this had been a problem in Vietnam. It was also a problem in Korea. Another result of the Vietnam War was Americans' distrust or suspicion of government's foreign policies. Americans felt betrayed in some senses by the United States' dishonesty and were less willing to become involved in foreign affairs. That's it for our presentation on Vietnam War. We'll talk more about this in class.